the Taxation, Annual Rates, Employee Allowances and Remedial Matters Bill to the House. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. Dr David Clark.
Mr Speaker, Labor will support the Taxation, Annual Rates, Employee Allowances and Remedial Matters Bill to the Select Committee. Mr Bennett suggests that I sit down at that point, but I won't, because I have some reservations that I wish to express straight off the bat. We're supporting it to Select Committee because we think it is a bill that can be improved, and we're hopeful that the government will be willing to work with us on that, despite the somewhat limp start they've made here in this bill that we have before us. We know that many areas of the tax law need either improving on or proper policing. And just this week we've heard that there's $1 billion now in tax unpaid by self-employed people, with literally hundreds of people owing more than $1 million each, self-employed people. How has their debt got that high? I hear David Bennett ask. Well, quite frankly, it is because the Inland Revenue Department has not intervened early enough, has either not had the tools or the resources to stop debt growing and to stop those tax bills rising. And as a consequence, that area of unclaimed tax, unpaid tax, is now over $1 billion and rising, which is a quarter of the government's asset sales program. And if we look at the complete amount of unpaid tax that sits on the IRD's books, on the government books, it is now twice the value of the government's asset sales program. I repeat that. There is now twice the value of the government's asset sales program in unpaid tax on the government's books. This is a government that's taken its eye off the ball. This is a government that is not collecting the tax that is due. This is the very point that Mr Tremaine raised at the start of his speech when he talked about fair tax payment and fair tax collection. But it does also get to the other point which Mr Tremaine raised about growth in the economy. And in fact, we have recognised, and it's important to recognise from the start, that this particular government has the worst growth record of any government in the last 50 years in New Zealand. And that is not helped by this bill. This bill simply is not, as it stands, supporting the kind of decisive change that would be needed to transform the economy, to make it grow like it ought to in the situation New Zealand finds itself in, where primary produce prices are the highest at record levels. And New Zealand has had all of the opportunities in the world, but seems to have lagged in growth. The unemployment's remained high. It's still higher than when this government took office. This government has apparently been sitting on its hands when ordinary New Zealanders have been struggling. We've found that in recent days a number of other revelations have come out about the Inland Revenue and its stresses, because it has not been supported by this government. As I said at the outset, Mr Speaker, the government has taken its eye off the ball, and so that's why we've got this tinkering. That's why we don't have a bill that actually addresses the big issues. The Prime Minister said nearly 2 years ago that this computer system in the IRD was holding back tax policy. The Prime Minister said it in his own words, that this computer system in the IRD was holding back the development of tax policy. 2 years on, $50 million later, we have from the government $50 million spent on international consultants. We have from the government an in-principle agreement to develop further business cases to one day, hopefully, address the computer issues which are becoming increasingly dire. That is a waste of taxpayers' money, I have to say. $50 million for an in-principle agreement to proceed. This is something our IRD was telling this government 5 long years ago when it was first elected. 5 long years ago, 5 years ago, it was saying that the computer system was on its last legs, that something needed to be done. 2 years ago, John Key finally caught up and said, yes, something must be done, and it is holding tax policy back. And 2 years on, and another $50 million later, we have agreement that in principle something should be done about it. And then we have this news this week of $1 billion outstanding in self-employed tax owing. $8 billion, the total amount of tax owed by New Zealanders that hasn't been collected, twice the government's asset sales program value. That is embarrassing, and well, those members opposite might hang their heads in shame. Because this is an embarrassment to the government. And then we have this bill before us which attempts to tinker with some of these things, attempts to tinker with the thin capitalisation rules, which clearly and patently are not working. Companies, international companies, regard paying tax in New Zealand now as something of an amusement. They pay as little as they like. They sometimes pay a little bit for show, but comparable companies with equivalent revenue will pay quite different amounts of tax as to whether they are listed on the NZX and there is transparency about their tax affairs and a requirement to pay a dividend and sort out the imputation credits that go with it, or as to whether their head office is overseas, in which case they tend to pay, with equivalent revenue flows, far, far less tax. This government has failed to address the issues of the day in respect of tax avoidance by multinationals, and it seems to have very few ideas about how it's going to do that. It does not even have an estimate of the size of the tax that it is foregoing. Last week, Mr Speaker, I asked in the financial review of the Inland Revenue Department the Commissioner as to whether the department had an estimate of foregone tax due to avoidance and evasion behaviour, and they said they did not. They did not have the resources necessary to calculate that amount. They have other priorities right now, and I bet those other priorities are piecing the computer system together with sellotape and blue tack. The $8 billion outstanding, they'll be doing what they can on their little abacuses to work out how on earth they're going to collect that. And the rebuild, upon which they've spent $50 million in consultants' money, has only reached the in-principle agreement stage. This is disgraceful. This is absolutely disgraceful, Mr Speaker. More decisive action needs to be taken by this government than what we find in this bill. In this bill, we also have some legislation which has been very quietly kept out of the public eye up until now, the issues in response to the Foreign Account Tax Compliant Act passed in the United States. That act required all banks abroad to supply information on US persons. Now, we're not clear exactly what the definition of US persons is or are. The banks don't actually yet know. The IRD has not refined exactly what a US person is. On Wikipedia, it's defined very much in line with the Surveillance Act. So what we have here is the kind of thing we saw under the GCSB Act, where the government is supplying information to the US on their bidding. And what is it asking for in return, Mr Speaker? That is what I hear. That is what I hear. That is exactly what the government is asking for in return. This government is quite happy to hand over information on people with bank accounts in New Zealand, but it is asking nothing in terms of tax transparency of the United States. Absolutely nothing. This is a government that seems to be sitting on its hands as far as protecting New Zealand tax base is concerned. Tax transparency is something they've started to talk about now, but there is absolutely no action on that front. Multinationals are choosing whether or not to pay tax. The IRD seems to have no real plan for tackling that issue. This government has made no statements about the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act other than smuggling it through, Mr Speaker, in the innocuously named Taxation, Annual Rates, Employee Allowances and Remedial Matters Bill. And it will require banks to supply information on anyone who is a US citizen, fair enough, to supply information on anyone who might have a US address, on anyone who might have somebody carrying out transactions on their behalf in the US, but also on people who were born in the US, whether or not they think they have any kind of ongoing relationship with the US. The New Zealand government seems set to supply their ongoing personal financial information to the United States, asking absolutely nothing in return. The IRD has, at this stage, no plans, it seems, to gather information on tax avoidance in New Zealand, that is resident and haven situations in the US or abroad, or that the US government has knowledge about, and it is simply rolling over and accepting that it will comply with this US law, that it will demand the banks conform without actually giving them proper guidance. The banks themselves are upset about the slow progress of the IRD, the lack of guidance on these issues, and the upset that this will cause to their customers, who will be now giving away personal information they would not previously have expected to give away. This is a government that is in turmoil in respect of tax collection. The outstanding amount of $8 billion is ringing in our ears. Its statistics were due yesterday on its poor performance, on the dropping compliance, in the tax system. We learnt in the Select Committee that 3 out of 4 phone calls is its current 3 out of 4 phone calls it's expecting to answer on the telephone now, and it's not meeting that target. It is not hitting the target of asking 3 out of 4 customer inquiries. And that is an absolute disgrace. This is a department under pressure. It's a department that's not performing from a government that's taken its eye off the ball.
I call a point of order.
Mr. Speaker.
Point of order. Sorry, it's a point of order. The Honourable Ruth Dyson.
Conclusion of my colleague's speech, the member from Hamilton, David Bennett, made an unparliamentary remark and as an interjection, and I'd asked you to ask him to withdraw and apologise.
Well, I didn't hear that. Otherwise, I would have certainly intervened if there was an unparliamentary comment made. I'll just remind members of Speaker's rulings on page 42. Now, I'm calling Paul Goldsmith.
Mr. Speaker.